Hey, a quick reminder before we start the show. The Business of Politics podcast is celebrating its first year, and you get the gift. So when you leave a review on Apple Podcasts for the show and let me know whether that's by email, Twitter, or LinkedIn, I'll send you one of our official show mugs that I give to every guest. Now on to the show.
There's a big difference between somebody spending $4 million in a week and $7 million in a week, and we needed to figure out what were the accurate numbers, and we were able to build an algorithm to do it.
I'm Eric Wilson, Managing Partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you're joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. Today, we're joined by Stephen Aaron, the founder of 527 Tracker, a new website that aggregates, analyzes, and alerts users to super PAC spending in real time. He also runs Perspective Strategies, a public affairs firm based in Washington, D.C. He's got a long background in the policy and communications side of politics. In our conversation, we learn more about what 527 Tracker is seeing ahead of the midterms, how Stephen became an entrepreneur, and what he's learned from building software. Stephen, 527 Tracker is doing something I haven't seen anywhere else, which is tracking super PAC spending on things like mail and canvassing. So explain for us, how are you able to collect that data?
It kind of started with a problem where I needed to figure out where, for my clients, where another super PAC was spending against us. And I just couldn't find good data on it. I couldn't find good aggregation on it. I couldn't figure out over what periods of time they were spending, who they were spending it with. And so I just began to go look for these databases, and there's actually a lot of information out there. What I figured out was the information was available. It just never been aggregated. And so what we did was we just started pulling it all together. And kind of what makes 527 Tracker different is we are able to pull in things like canvassing spend, mail spend, real numbers on digital, things like that. But another one of the big things that really makes it powerful is we aggregate it all into a platform, and our algorithms have been able to develop a plumb line. So we're able to figure out exactly what these spends are. These are not just numbers that are being pulled from broadcasters and other places. We force all the numbers to reconcile. One of the things that we learned early on was that the data is actually really, really dirty, and it's very hard to actually figure out exactly what the spend is. And, there's a big difference between somebody spending $4 million in a week and $7 million in a week. And we needed to figure out what were the accurate numbers, and we were able to build an algorithm to do it.
So can you elaborate on that a little bit more? When you say the data was dirty, what does that mean?
Well, you have a lot of spends change over time. So, whether it's a TV spend or a digital spend, you might reserve a certain amount of time, and you might make an outlay for a certain amount of time. But that can change because of dynamic races. We've seen one October surprise this week in the Georgia Senate race. And one of the things we're watching inside the platform is, does this force people to change their spend? Are more groups coming in and spending more money? Are there some groups that were spending money that are not anymore? But all that to say, these numbers aren't static. So when a number comes in, you have to understand how this number is going to move, and you have to be able to track with its movement if your numbers are going to be accurate. And so we had to develop some pretty elaborate algorithms to move with these numbers so that we were able to get live, accurate numbers in real time for every federal race in the country.
Got it. So our listeners are probably familiar with, some of the public ad libraries that are available with Facebook, Google, and then certainly FCC. But what are you looking at to determine mail and canvassing?
Well, there's really only a couple places where those numbers come from, and those numbers are generally available out of the FEC. And so, we can pull those numbers there and add them into our algorithm. That's generally where they come from.
Got it. It's fascinating. It's something that no one else has ever thought to organize, because these independent expenditure committees, super PACs, have to report their activity in real time, and you're bringing that all together. I'm curious, what are some of the tactics that you're seeing with these super PACs this cycle? Where are they spending their money?
The vast majority of the spend, for not surprisingly, is being spent in the Senate races. it's probably a little under a third that's being spent on the House races. The rest of it's being spent in the Senate. When you begin to aggregate these numbers, you can begin to see a move over time. So, we television spend is always very heavy. That's not surprising. But literally this week, we're seeing what we were just talking about. We're seeing an enormous amount of money move into canvas and mail. Because that's a surefire way to contact a voter. When you put an ad on TV, you don't know if there's going to be an eyeball on it or not. You can target well on TV, and you can target well on some of the cord cutters, Hulu and others, but it's not like putting a piece of mail in somebody's mailbox, where every American in the country has a mailbox and they check it. Same thing with knocking on somebody's door. Like, you're going to talk to a voter. So we're seeing money move from the advertising into the more voter contact of canvassing and mail.
So you're starting to see them shift over into get out the vote mode.
Absolutely. There's still some persuasion happening, and there still is time for that, but we're seeing an enormous amount of money move into exactly that, the get out the vote effort.
You mentioned cord cutters and streaming platforms. What kind of trend or proportion are you seeing? Are super PACs spending more on that front and pulling back TV buys, or is it just getting more expensive across the board?
It's more expensive across the board, and specifically we named this the 527 tracker because it tracks specifically independent expenditure groups. And 527s is the original super PAC. That's right. the IRS code for it. So that's why we named it the 527 tracker. Broadcast TV is still the base of all campaign operations, but there is a lot of money that is moving into the more online streaming platforms.
And one thing that our listeners will probably remember from other conversations is that you, as a super PAC or a 527, are spending essentially commercial rates. Candidates get a discount on their broadcast TV buying. Super PACs don't get that. So they're actually paying more for the same amount of TV that a candidate would get.
Right. But the amount of, so that there's been some write up on that. There's been a little bit of, I've seen a few articles being written about the distinction between the two, but the amount of money that's flowing through these super PACs is so beyond what campaigns can make up or even spend that it's almost not even relevant to the conversation. You've had, here, we'll just pull the fresh numbers right now, but SLF has spent.
That's our Senate Leadership Fund. That's the Mitch McConnell aligned super PAC.
Senate Leadership Fund. That's exactly right. McConnell aligned PAC. I'm just going to pull the numbers for you. I'll watch all the numbers after Labor Day because that's when the spend really starts. And on the front page of the homepage, we actually do a live graph of spend over a 7-day moving average. And you can see it explode on Labor Day. So it's a really interesting visual if anybody wants to go see that, because you can see how much money begins to move in these races. But since Labor Day, the Senate Leadership Fund has spent $114.89 million.
Wow.
That's in 33 days. They've spent $114 million.
And that's TV, that's digital, that's everything.
It's everything. There's been... since Labor Day, $487 million spent total. That's across House and Senate races, across every super PAC, $487 million.
That's really interesting. And one of the things that we've seen in some of the academic literature is sort of evidence of the earlier you spend, the more impact your advertising has, where people start to make up their minds really early. So there's an actually interesting kind of cultural shift where you see the left likes to spend really early, where they try and define their candidates, define their opponents. The right takes a view of people aren't paying attention until after Labor Day. And so you just see these huge numbers come in once summer is over.
Yeah, it's and we're gonna figure out which one is right here shortly. That's been as people have been paying attention. There's been a big debate going on inside the NRSC because Rick Scott calculated that early spend would be more impactful, and so he spent a lot of the NRSC money trying to define the playing field, trying to define the issues that were going to be talked about in the election. I think there's a lot of evidence that it worked early, but then. Things began to change over the summer. Narratives changed. These races are very dynamic, and so the issues began to move, and it was not as such a favorable environment for Republicans. And so now the SLF, the Senate Leadership Fund, is making up an enormous amount of spend on the Republican side, where the NRSC has not been able to spend as much because they spent so early on. So we're about to find out how short is the American memory.
Yeah. So what are some of the other things that the data you're monitoring are telling you about the midterms that we're not hearing in the media?
Well, that's one of the things that makes this platform so special is there's nobody who is aggregating this data in real time and making it available through analysis. So I can go in there and see, and anybody can, it's open to the public, but the 527 tracker allows you to go in and see how money is moving these races. So one of the things that's really interesting is watching where money is not being spent. And so up until about a week and a half ago, there was very little to no money being spent the Senate races in Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. Significant money moved in last week into the Colorado race, and there was some money. There was about $2 million that came into the Washington race. The Colorado one was really interesting because the Democrats do not have the advantage in the outside spend. Senate Leadership Fund is going to outspend the Senate Majority PAC, the Schumer aligned PAC. We'll see what it looks like at the end of the day, but right now there's probably spending a third to twice as much money as the Senate Majority PAC. So all that to say, it's a long-winded way of saying Democrats don't have the luxury of spending in places where they don't need to spend. And on paper, Senator Bennet is up by 8 points. And so if that is really the case, why did Democratic groups spend $5.5 million in 1 week in Colorado last week? And the answer is probably because they're seeing something that we can't see. So they feel like they need to go in and burnish his numbers and provide a little overhead cover, try to push down Joe O'Dea, because they feel like they see something that is causing them to feel like O'Dea is gaining ground on Bennet. I had a reporter ask me yesterday, is the New Hampshire Senate race something that is not being fully covered yet? So I went and looked at the numbers and I said, probably not. There is some Republican money being spent in New Hampshire, but that's not surprising. They do have the luxury of spending in places where they don't need to. So that looks like an effort to expand the map at the moment, not a race that has already come online. And those are the types of things that you can see when you can get these numbers aggregated in front of you, and you can sort them, by time or by committee. If you want to come in and see how much is the Senate Majority PAC spending inside a certain time frame with a certain vendor in a certain race, it'll tell you that in 3 seconds.
Yeah, one of the things that I always remind people of is when you have these midterm elections that are governed by sort of sentiment for or against the party in power, the map expands in some odd ways. I think back to 2010, right? The midterms right after Barack Obama was first elected. And there were races that were suddenly coming on the map in October that had not been on anyone else's radar all year long. And it's just the nature of the environment. And I think we're starting to see some of that, as you point out, places like Colorado and Washington State, where it's kind of surprising that Republicans are competitive there and putting up a fight, and we may just win. So I think that's really interesting when you see that coming in the data, because that's the spin and the messaging that gets reported on is one thing, but where you're spending your money, where you're putting your dollars down, really says more about your strategy.
That's it. That's why I use the hashtag all the time, money talks, because it's exactly that. You can go on, you can have your spinsters on talking all day about how the Oregon Senate race is going to become competitive or has become competitive, or where you're seeing the polling. But we all know that you can pay for polling to do what you want it to do. But whether or not there's millions of dollars being invested in the race is where the rubber really hits the road. And, there isn't much spend happening in Oregon right now. But like I said,
right,
I've been surprised to see Democratic Senate aligned groups spending money against Smiley in Washington and O'Dea in Colorado, because that means they're seeing something. Right. But I have not yet seen money moving into the New Hampshire Senate race, or Democrats moving money into the Hampshire Senate race, which would indicate that they believe Hassan is in trouble.
And I will just play devil's advocate there, which is there are also cases where donors come to a super PAC and with no data backing it up, they say, "Oh, I want to spend in this state or I want to spend in this race." So they could be seeing the potential for dollars, right? And it may not be aligned with data.
That is certainly the truth. That certainly does happen where you have a donor just invested in a certain race and they just want to see, they just want to either protect that seat or there's some message that they want to see penetrate into that state, and they'll stand up a super PAC or give to a super PAC that'll go do it. So that is certainly possible, and that gets to exactly the point, which is I haven't seen more money move into Colorado. So let's see, as of today, there's been $9 million spent in Colorado since Labor Day, and there is no new money that has been spent against Joe O'Dea.
Right.
So that spend of $5.5 million that was outlaid a week and a half ago, there's not been anything to backfill that. So it could have been exactly that, where a donor came in and said, "Hey, I want to make sure we're taking care of Senator Bennett. Run this against O'Dea," and they did. Now, if we start seeing more expenditures show up against O'Dea, then we know that there really is a belief that Senator Bennett could be in trouble.
It's a really fascinating chess match. And one of the things that I think gets underappreciated is oversaturating races, right? Where, you take a look at the Georgia runoffs in 2021, right? Where you literally cannot buy another second of TV advertising. Right. And so what are some of the signals that you look for in your data to see that a race is becoming oversaturated with that outside 527 spending?
It's kind of hard to figure out exactly where that tipping point is, especially when you've got some of these groups, particularly on the Republican side, like the NRA or Americans for Prosperity, who have really good ground games and can spend money in different places. It's very difficult to stand up a ground game and really employ people on the ground. That takes a lot of planning.
This is people door knocking, volunteering, making calls.
Door knock, exactly. These are the volunteers on the ground going door to door. That takes a lot of time and a lot of planning. It's also very expensive. So, from that standpoint, you don't really hit an oversaturation point there, but you literally, as you just mentioned, you can buy every point of TV. You can even buy all of the inventory on digital. It can happen. Right. And I think they probably hit that in the South Carolina Senate race last year as well between Lindsey Graham and Jamie Harris, right, where, they spent almost $200 million just amongst the candidates.
You run out of internet. Yeah.
You literally run out of internet. And so, it's an interesting question. I'll have to be watching to see if these buys, if the advertising buys slow down, because if they do, it means we've probably hit a saturation point. But I hadn't thought of analyzing the data that way. But that'll be a very interesting thing to look at. For example, since September 4th, we have spent, there has been spent $48,928,000 in the Pennsylvania Senate race. That's a lot of money.
A little bit, yeah.
And that's just in outside spending. That does not count what Oz or Fetterman are spending. And
much less the C4s and
the C4s and others. And that spending doesn't compare to the outside spending. Fetterman and Oz, I haven't seen their numbers come out, but they're going to spend, in the tens of millions of dollars over the entire cycle. Right. And we've got tens of millions of dollars being spent in weeks. And we're still 32 days out from the election today. So, we might see another $50 million come into this race before it's over, which is just an insane amount of money.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Stephen Aaron, founder of 527 Tracker. I'm curious, Stephen, what drove you to build 527 Tracker? You mentioned at the top that you were trying to solve your own problem, but obviously you took this a step further and turned it into a product.
We launched Perspective Strategies earlier this year, and it was we launched 527 Tracker as a product of Perspective Strategies, because the point of building the company of Perspective Strategies was just a belief that there is a smarter, better, more informed way of engaging DC and creating real influence. And that's what this whole thing is about, is how do we understand how this very dynamic political situation affects companies, affects businesses, the way that they make decisions? How does that affect their bottom line? And the 527 Tracker was born out of exactly that. I had a client that had somebody spending against them, and it was creating real problems for them. And so, the first thing we had to do was figure out when they were spending, how much they were spending, where they were spending, why they were spending. And so it took a lot of information and data to figure that out. And it was not data that was readily available. And I couldn't figure out, I knew all the data was available, but it wasn't aggregated. It wasn't easy to understand. I couldn't figure out why, because it's very valuable data. And so for this one project, we just aggregated the data up and laid a little analysis on top of it, and everything just popped and it became crystal clear. And it was very easy to understand, and we were able to begin to build strategies around that. And so
those are my favorite kinds of startups, right? Where there's a clearly identified problem that someone out there is solving with their own spreadsheet. And
it was literally
they go out and build software.
Sheet.
Right.
That was it. It was an Excel sheet. Once I had all the data in an Excel sheet, I could make it do exactly what I wanted it to do. And so I realized that whether if you're a campaign manager, and that's one of the other things that 527 does, is you can go in and set alerts. So if you're a campaign manager and you've got staff spending time understanding where other super PACs are spending against you, making sure that you're aware of all the spends that are happening, that takes
or more likely you're not even doing that.
Right? You may not even be doing it. You're probably not. And if you are, it takes a lot of time. And what this does is it makes it all very easy, simple. It's right in front of you, and it'll send you an email anytime somebody is spending against you. Or if you want to set an alert and you want to see anytime the Senate Leadership Fund is spending with a certain vendor in a certain race between $10,000 and $100,000, it'll send you an alert for that.
Yeah. So once you aggregate the data, you can do lots of stuff on top of it. So what in this process has surprised you the most about building software? Your background is in politics and communications and policy. What's been the biggest learning from you building software?
Probably it was 2 or 3 different things. The first one would be how difficult the data is. Because like I said, when you first think about it, you're like, oh, so a super PAC is going to spend X or has spent X on a certain day. And on another day, they spent Y. And on another day, they spent Z. We can just add it up and it's all easy and it's right there in front of you. And until we got into the data, we didn't understand how dynamic it was, how dirty the data was, how many errors are in it, even from the people spending the money. And so we had to go in and figure out, all right, how do we create a baseline against which we can measure these spends so we know exactly what they are? And that was really the tricky part, was creating that baseline so that we could figure out, the true numbers, because numbers aren't worth anything if they're not accurate. Like I said earlier, if somebody's spending $7 million against you, but the numbers you're getting are 4, then that's a big problem. You're off by almost 50%. And your reaction, your response to somebody spending 7 versus 4 against you is going to be dramatically different. So, and the other big thing I learned is just the power of having the data aggregated, just seeing with the speed with which you can move these numbers around. I mean, you've heard me do it right here. If I want to see what's in the Pennsylvania Senate race, it takes me 3 seconds. Or if you want to see, a certain vendor in a certain race on a certain day, it's very, very powerful from a number of different perspectives. Once we started aggregating these numbers, what popped was we now see all the errors, and we didn't expect that. So, I get an email every day that tells me all the different groups that have errors inside their spending, because I can see it, because we force all the numbers to reconcile. So, it just popped how big and how many use cases were out there, whether it's media who just wants quick access to easy data, or a campaign that just wants to know exactly when somebody is spending against them and exactly how much. They probably don't care for the broader playing field. They just want to know when somebody's spending against them, and that's it. There's a ton of universities and researchers and things that are going to want to use this as a part of their analysis. There's betting platforms that seeing how this money moves a race. If you're playing on Predict It, you're going to have a lot better analysis of where these races are moving if you're watching the spend. Right. So, that was what was surprising to me, was just how powerful this data became once you began to aggregate it.
Yeah, I think that's really the power of some of this early work in the digital transformation of politics, right? We don't fully understand how people might use this data once it is put together. So, for example, we were talking about oversaturation, One of the things that you can now do is say, look, I'm looking at this race, and we know from studying past races that once you hit $10 million a month, you're getting diminishing returns. So let's go to another state where that extra $2 or $3 million could make an outsized difference. And so you've already shared some of these ways that people are using the data to drive their action and their decision making. Are there some other use cases that you're hoping to see on the horizon?
Well, I think it's probably going to be a little bit of just continuing to discover what people do with this data. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody who had just picked it up for their firm, and they were considering using the data in a way that I had not even considered. And so, I think there's going to continue to be people who create new ways of using this analysis for purposes that we never even envisioned or designed. And it's going to be really fun to watch that come out. And like you just said, I hadn't even thought about analyzing how does this spend move as some of these races like Pennsylvania probably hit saturation on the advertising side. I have to imagine we're pretty close to that point already. And so does the money slow down and move somewhere else because there's no more ad space to buy, or do they start trying to do more mail? It'll be really fun watching some of that.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us for this great conversation. Visit 527tracker.com to see all of this data that he's talking about, and we'll include a link to that in the show notes. If this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, all that we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. You also look smarter in that process. Remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you get your podcasts. You'll never miss an episode that way. And if you prefer, you can also get email updates on our new website at businessofpoliticspodcast.com. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.